Hey, what's going on, everybody? So today we're going to be talking about Json Web Tokens. I have Joseph Branch and Colby Fayok, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yep, you
And
got it.
yeah, I actually needed some help here, so I reached out for support from a few other developers, and we're just going to be doing a little discussion on implementation. So I've implemented Json Web Tokens before, and right now I'm going to be putting together a tutorial using React and Django. So I'm going to be doing a full implementation video on that. And the methods that I had, I didn't really feel too confident in them. So I want to just have an open discussion, maybe find a better solution. Colby implements JSON Web Tokens or just tokens in the more in the front end. Joseph is a smart dude that kind of knows everything, I guess. So they're going to be helping me out here, and we'll just be discussing that. So before we get started, I actually want to do a quick background of what JSON Web Tokens are. I don't have like a presentation ready or anything like that, just because we just decided this like half an hour ago. And I was talking to Joseph. We're going to do a phone call. And I thought, okay, why not just stream it and have an open discussion? Because I am trying to start live coding a little bit. So I figured this can be that first step and not having organized streams, but just more casual conversations. So and you guys can jump in, by the way, anytime you want. But for those of you guys that don't know what JSON Web Tokens are, I'm going to pull up a screen here. And the first thing is I want to show you a website that I like to use. Let me get my phone notes up here. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. I'll probably do, I guess this actually works fine right here. So this is a website called jwt.io, and I guess it zooms in. And this actually allows you to create tokens and test tokens. And all JSON Web Tokens are a way of implementing authentication and authorization into your website. So authentication and authorization sometimes mixed up for the same thing, but they are two different things. Authorization is when you try to authorize, or authentication is when you try to authenticate a user. So like somebody types in a username and password, you authenticate who they are. So
And
yeah,
can I jump in right
go
there?
ahead.
Because I was trying to remember what my friend Austin, and he should be in the chat, told me. So authentication is who you are, and authorization is what you can do. Pretty much is how I break that down.
Yeah, that's right. So I always get those mixed up there. So you said the authentication is who you are, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
because I want to make sure the user is who they say they are. And then, going into things like role-based access, I want to make sure in terms of authorization that if you're an admin versus a regular user, what you can do.
Yeah, and what you can do on that site. So yeah, so we'll jump back into that. So we first check who you are, and when a user gets authenticated, we get back a token. So this is a different way of implementing it. If you guys are anybody with a Django background, which most people here probably are, you're probably familiar with session authentication. So that's how Django by default goes through that authorization and authentication process. Well, when you're building out an API, specifically in this case, we're using the Django REST framework, you usually need something like a token. In theory, you could use session authentication, but once you're starting to work with, when the application isn't on the same server, you're trying to have like an open API for people. That's where tokens come in. And I specifically really like JSON Web Tokens because I'm not having to store anything in the database for that. So once we authenticate a user, we get back this token, and that's all it is. It's a token that encrypts user data. And there's different ways of doing this. So Django will actually get back this token. If you look at it, we can actually just paste this token in here, and then we can see the data about this user. So in this case, we're just storing some information about the user, the name, and the expiration date. So that's probably hard to see. But in this case, this user expires in 2 days and at 6 p.m. GMT time. So once we get back this token, a user can store this token. And Joseph, I want to talk about this because I've seen implementation in local storage. I've seen it in cookies and HTTP only cookies. So there's different ways of doing that. So we get back this token, and now in authorization on every single request, typically you want to have protected routes in an application. Let's say you don't want an authenticated, or you don't want an unauthenticated user to see a specific route or maybe an admin page. This token is sent on every request. And I actually took some pictures, just found them on a Google search here. So let's pull this up here. So it looks something like this. A user requests a token, they get back a refresh token and an access token. That gets stored somewhere in the browser. And then every single time you're requesting a certain page here, you are getting back information based on the credentials in that token. or that token has for that specific user. So the refresh token, that's my specific part in what I'm trying to focus on here. In this case, you see this process where we send a request, and in this case, let's say a token expires, because a token can expire in about let's say 5 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever you want that to be. And at this point, what you want to do is find that error. We get back an error, and we want to send a refresh token to update that token. That means just to modify that data and verify that this user is still able to go in and access certain pages. And that refresh token typically has a lifespan that's a little bit longer. That could be 30 days. It could be a couple months, whatever you want that to be. So once we get that refresh token, we get back a new token, store that somewhere. And now on every single request, we are going through that process and actually authorizing that user. So yeah, let's go back in here. I'll open the screens up here. So my question here, Joseph, I want to start with you here, because you talked about storing the token, and I know Ben Awad has a good video on this, and he was also referencing HTTP only cookies. And then I've also seen people that seem pretty credible also talking about local storage and saying that that's totally fine. So it's kind of interesting, because I want to know, what are the dangers do you think are in storing that in local storage versus HTTP only cookies, or cookies in general?
So HTTP only cookies is, and Austin, if you're in the chat, you can definitely help me with that one. I know, or at least the part with the local storage. For me, HTTP only cookies, you can't access them with client-side JavaScript. So that's one of the big differences with doing it on the client side and doing it on the server side. If I use a HTTP only cookie, then the data that's getting transferred is held in the browser at some point, or it's held in the browser at some point, but it's attached to each request, and it gets sent back with every request to the server. So the server is then doing the validation for the data inside of the HTTP only cookie. Rather, as if you do it client side, then the user can actually see it. It's somebody like me that goes through websites and just checks and inspects data. If I see the access token, I might just play around with it, and then I could break, a route on your back end on accident just because I alter one of the data. And, with Jwats, when you alter data in a Jwat, it alters the hash attached to the Jwat. So doing that, I could potentially break a route on accident and, and I'll be telling you, hey, there's an error with your program the whole time. There's really nothing wrong with it. I just messed something up as a user. So it's pretty much that whole thing with only giving users access to stuff that they need access to, because if a user has access to it, then they're going to do absolutely everything wrong that they can to, just because that's who they are. But,
yeah, and what you're saying, your point is there, you can use a little bit of JavaScript and just find a cookie just like that. Like
absolutely.
You can go into the console and find it.
Yeah, I think it's like document.cookie or something like that.
Yeah, document.cookie will give you all the cookies, and then you can just find what you need.
And that's the same for things. So if I'm a malicious user, and I don't know, I guess a rare case, if I had access to your computer and, I got in remote. I got in remote to your computer. I was able to see local storage. Then I could just take your cookie out of local storage and use it on my computer, or not take a cookie, but take that access token out of local storage, use it on my computer, and start passing data back and forth to my computer, and you never know. Now, the thing is, with HTTP only cookies, that wouldn't be the case, because, obviously, if you got remote access and, you just started doing stuff where the user could see, then it's different. But if I'm trying to be cryptic and hide behind the scenes or something like that, a little bit.
What can happen if you have that cookie? You're saying that you can start doing stuff with it, but if a token, you technically don't have all the. First of all, if you're implementing it in the HTTP or in local storage, does that mean somebody would have to grab your computer and grab it, right? It's not like anybody can grab that. So that means it's in your browser.
Well, if somebody's running a script on your,
right.
Like if somebody injected a script into a particular web page, they can still access that. If somebody injected into your personal website, somebody accesses that, and you have that stored in local storage, somebody would be able to still access that information.
I think is it a CSRF attack or
CSRF attack?
It's either CSRF or it might be a cross-site scripting attack. One of those, I can't remember which one offhand. I want to think maybe it's cross-site scripting, where they can, have you click on a link or something like that, and then it'll allow them to pretty much it'll run a script like he was saying behind the scenes, and they can get whatever they want at that point.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I've seen a lot of implementation. I actually did a full course, and maybe I should add that as a bonus video. But I put it in local storage, and I was, yeah, as I'm doing it, I don't feel that confident, and this is where I'm like, okay, maybe I should get some guys that know a different part of this.
Right, and I'm looking at the chat, and Austin said it's XXX, which I believe is cross-site scripting.
Gotcha. Okay, so anybody can, in theory, if my site's popular enough, or they know me, they want to do something malicious, they can grab that token and they can start doing that. That's true, and especially if you have admin access. Like, if it's just a typical user, well, you can go and update a random user's data, which is still not good, but now you can actually do something. So yeah, HTTP only. I'm gonna have to figure out how to implement that, because I might have to do that in that next video. I'll have to learn how to do that the Django way.
Right, HTTP only. I've done it once, and it's not really difficult. It's more so the site has to be a HTTPS site, as far as I know. And then once you do that, it's just as simple as creating the well, I did it with sessions. So when I did it with sessions, it was making the session secure only, or I think there was a secure variable for creating the session in Node.js. You set it to true, then you set HTTPS to true, and that literally makes it at that point HTTP only cookie. So it was like setting 2 parameters to true, and at that point it was HTTP only. But it's a whole bunch of, I mean, if you know how to set it up, like I'm pretty sure you do with HTTPS, then you should be good.
So as far as like implementation, Colby, you said you mainly go in, you do this on the server, on the browser side or client side, right?
Yeah, so I think like the interesting thing is like, because there's kind of 2 different cookies, the way that we've kind of approached this before is where we're not as concerned about storing like the access token on local storage, because like they generally have like a really short shelf life. So if they do get compromised, at least they're not going to be there for a long time. But absolutely never storing that refresh token online. So one of the things we've done in the past is where we would persist like a database behind like serverless functions, so that we would have a way to safely store those refresh tokens for people and validate those requests. And then anytime it goes to expire, we would refresh that on their behalf.
So that's cool. So like what you said, you're talking about the issue of somebody running that script. And in this case, it's specifically the refresh token that's really important, because if that access token, let's say, has a shelf life of 30 days, then that's bad. But typically they only have a shelf life of like 5 minutes to 30 minutes sometimes. So that's actually an area that I want to focus on, is talking about the difference between that. So where do you store that? You said you're also using HTTP only cookies, or you find a different way to actually implement that?
So when I've done it in the past, and I believe we've used JWT for that, because when you ultimately like save it in the JWT, we can send that up to the server, and they'll be able to decode that and actually access the information, as opposed to like a raw code being stored in local storage or something. But so once we pass that off to the server, or serverless function rather, they would decode that JWT, they would grab that access token and try to make that request. And kind of like the diagram that you were showing before, if you get a 401 back, we'll try to actually refresh that for you. And if that doesn't work, we're, for whatever reason, if we revoke the refresh token or something, we would push you towards authentication. But the more likely scenario is that you would still be authenticated with that refresh token. So we would generate a new set of access tokens so that you can proceed with that request.
So the implementation still seems like it's on the server side then. I mean, like you're taking care of the front end portion of it, and then So for sure. That's like where I'm struggling. So I saw 2 different implementations of it, and I typically stuck to session storage in my other applications. But now when I'm implementing it, I was doing research, and it's actually kind of hard to find resources specifically with what I'm doing, or if they are, they're probably like in a long tutorial, so I have to find like that specific part. And I found a few, and they completely do it like, I guess, the wrong way, or maybe not the best way. So I wasn't really too fond of that. But the method that I saw was the first option. And Joseph, we were talking about this.
Right.
The first one I saw was basically to have like a check token status function before every single fetch request, or any call to the database, whether that's put, a post, or get, delete, whatever. And that seemed a little bit didn't seem dry to me, because you're having to throw in that function everywhere now. And basically what this function would do is, right before like that request is sent, it would quickly check the token life, and it would check the token, like if it's expired or not. And if it was, then it would send a request. It would just basically use a promise. It would send a request, quickly get a new token by sending that refresh token. and then it would continue on with that post request. So the error never actually occurs. So that request is never sent to the database unless that token was actually good. And that doesn't seem like the best way. And the way that I thought about implementing it was maybe to write my own middleware somewhere. And this is where I'm curious on what the actual implementation that you guys use. And I know you said the front end part, so maybe you're not too familiar with what's actually happening in the back end. But my guess would be to also write middleware, never let that request fail, but have basically the middleware stop it beforehand, check, is this token valid? If it is, continue. If it's not, then quickly go get a new token, get the new token back, and then continue on with the request to, in this case, I'm using Django, so back to the view and then let it process. So the second one, Joseph, you said seems a little bit better. Like it seems like the safer implementation.
Right. And that's just, I guess, for me, because I've never tried to do it on the front end, just because every place I've worked at or one that I talked to is always like, if you do anything in terms of validating, make sure you do it on the server side. And so I kind of think this falls into that realm of validation. Like I want to make sure you know who you are and everything that you can do with authentication and authorization. So I just lump that all as validation. But the way that I've implemented or seen it implemented is there's generally on the server side a private function that's responsible for refreshing the token and refreshing the access token specifically, I guess I should say that. And then you make a request, and like you said, you have that middleware. So that middleware checks, okay, is this access token still alive? Is it valuable? And it has a signature and then the secrets attached to it as well. So you go through and you're also verifying, is this token the correct token? And if this token is the correct token, after you do that, you check to see, is this token still alive and usable? And if it is, then of course the middleware should proceed with the request. But I'm assuming in the middleware, there's a catch block that if it isn't, you're going to, go to hit the route or private function that's responsible for the refreshing of the access token, return the refreshed access token. You'll sign it, do all the same things you did initially to create the access token, return that access token back to the function, and then send that back. Return it back to the function. And I lost track of my thought. Return it back to the function. I know, right? Return it back to the function, and then you can proceed from there, because now it's kind of like, I won't say a loop, but you're kind of checking it twice for rather, and then or not. Okay, so in Node.js, there's the next function. So then you just call next after you've returned the access token or something.
So it's kind of like a promise, right? It's not exactly like a promise, but because it is waiting for something to be processed before it continues. But
so the way that I've done it in the past is like, so we wouldn't even have like a check function. What we would do is we would try to make that request, because the request that we were trying to make would ultimately tell us if it was unauthenticated. So we didn't have to make that separate request. But once we saw that it was unauthenticated, we would usually wrap that in a function where the function itself would basically be a retry. So you would create a function with that function that it'll first try to make that request, and then it'll authenticate, but then it'll just try to make that function, invoke that function again if it doesn't. So that's a nice kind of dry way to do it, so that you can wrap that around really any request that you want to make.
Gotcha. So the user technically never sees the error unless the refresh token fails somewhere, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and in terms of like an error, like it would really just be like you
like
logged out or something like that. So
let's say the token, I'm talking about like the refresh token would just let you know that you're expired basically. But if that first, let's say that 5-minute token expires and never goes back to the front end, it just continues on, gets that token. Now if that fails for some reason, then we continue from there. Gotcha.
Yeah, if that fails for some reason, I would say that's an implementation thing, because it should, once it works once, it should consistently work.
Yeah, I'm glad that I came to that conclusion, because every solution that I saw online was the first method that I found. So there just wasn't that many people actually talking about it, or maybe I'm looking it up the wrong way. And logically, it just made sense to me. I'm like, it makes sense to do this in middleware, because anytime I run into issues like this, instead of trying to find the solution somewhere online, I would think logically, what is the most dry way and secure way to do this? And middleware is one area where you can just catch that and take care of that. That's cool that I guess we came to the same conclusion.
Right. Yeah. And Oh, my bad. What were you gonna say, Kobe?
Oh, no. It's all good.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, and like he was talking about earlier, that's like the dry way to do it, because middleware, it'll be like one function, and you just plug it into all the routes and all the routes that you want it to be, and at that point, it does everything for you. And so the user should literally never know if their token has expired, or if they'll only know they don't have access if when they log out, both of the tokens are cleared. And sometimes the refresh token, I've seen it sometimes where the refresh token still remains, since it does have that longer lifespan, but both of the tokens can be cleared or one remains. And then at that point, if they don't have an access token at all because they've logged out, it'll throw back an error saying,
And just a quick point on top of that. So like, even though it's like they shouldn't, like they don't have to know about what the actual expiration or error message is, like it's also helpful to like by default not include any of those kind of details, because intruders can possibly use that to their advantage. Like if they know exactly why something is failing, they could use that to try to get by it.
Gotcha. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, I think you guys answered both of my main questions. So that's what I'm going to do. Like I built a to-do app with authentication just because it's an easier one to, it's a simple little application, and that was kind of where I was stuck. So I'm going to look into the HTTP only cookies. I'll try to figure that out. And I see a question about which token to store. So to clarify that was we're storing the original token in, or I guess both tokens, right? Because you'd have to store the refresh token in the browser, right?
So I would recommend not storing the refresh token, because that's going to be the one that'll provide the most access for somebody because it's long lived. Like if that's compromised, it's not just simply like, wait until session's dead. Like that's going to give them the ability to continue to refresh that over and over and over.
But in theory, when you log in, like when you authenticate a user, the refresh token and the access token come back to the front end. Is that correct? Like that's how I would understand that. You get back both tokens, and then they have to be stored somewhere.
Right.
So like, oh, you can go ahead.
No, you're good. You got it.
I was just gonna say, so like, if we were talking about JWTs, for instance, like you might be storing that JWT in local storage, where once you send that JWT to your serverless function or server, whatever, they're gonna decrypt that or decode it, which would include that access token.
Oh shit!
In reality. So like there are definitely instances where you are storing the access token, which generally is okay, I'd say, but like usually you're storing that JWT, which doesn't even include that, and the server itself is going to be what's grabbing that access token for you. Also, I know James Quick from Auth0. If you wanted to pop him on, he's in the chat there.
Is this him?
Yeah.
Oh, so he's as Auth0, not himself here.
Oh yeah, I don't know if that was intentional, but.
No.
And yeah, that's
how do I do? Oh shit, yeah. Let's James, if this is actually you, bark twice. Here, let's. He was actually the first person that came to mind. James, let me get you on Discord, and let me send you an invite. Here, I would love to have his take on things.
For sure. And that's what I would think. You might store the Jwat in an HTTP only cookie, so that way, they don't even have access to any of the information inside of it. Not that you should be sending secure information inside the Jwat anyway, because to me, other than the access tokens, if you're sending like roles and things like that, if you go to jwt.io, they can just put the Jwat in there and still see the information that you're so-called calling secret or credentials, or rather, I guess. That's my thought on that.
Yeah, I think with and also I love Jwat. I've never heard it said Jwat before. I just say
really?
JWT. But like I think you still need that, as long as you're encoding it with a key, like a secret key. And of course, unless that gets compromised, like they shouldn't be able to get a lot of that data from you.
That's true.
So James should join us in a second here. So as he joins, I'll load him up here. So I'm reading a question here from David. Refresh token endpoint has to be public, right? If access token expires, it would be okay. Here, let me pull this up. It would be okay to also send Django CSRF along with the request. That's gonna be a little bit different with a JSON Web Token, because if you're the CSRF token, that's usually with session authentication. So I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding the question right. Like you wouldn't use a CSRF token at this point, like that works with sessions.
So I think a lot of people actually kind of use both.
Really?
And because they protect against different things. And I'm saying this with not knowing a ton about how CSRF works, but I just know that from doing like project work before where like my team has because typically they'll dump that token into the page and that it'll still be used alongside of the request to validate the request itself.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I think that's less about the authentication. And once James gets on here, maybe he knows a little bit more than I do. But my understanding is that's less about authenticating the user as opposed to authenticating the request to prevent against malicious intent.
And if you're saying, David, if you're saying the refresh endpoint to be public, I would think it would be well. Maybe James can also answer that part. I don't want to say something.
He's gonna put us all to shame right now.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I'm no expert on.
So Auth0. That's oh. Well, let us know if you want to just talk that way. That works too. But we'd like to see your pretty face.
Give me a minute.
So Auth0, if I understand that right, I didn't do that much research, but I think it's like it's a third-party way of implementing it. Like in theory, right now I'm doing this manually. Like I used simple JWT from built-in Django. What's up, James? But Auth0, James, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's a third-party way to do it. So in theory, I can use that with Django. Is that correct? Or like any, I guess, Django or any other. Still
getting situated. Sorry. Yes. So Auth0 can do a lot of stuff. I have heard a mix of what y'all have been talking about, but like generating those JWTs, like if you were to roll your own auth when people log in, you'll create the JWT, send it back with them, and then you can store it in a cookie or local storage or whatever. There's detailed conversations about what's the best way to do that. So with Auth0, like it kind of abstracts you away from different potential ways to log in. So if you do social connections, or if you get deeper into like enterprise connections, that sort of stuff, and you use like their SDKs. I haven't done it with Django myself, but their SDKs to help facilitate that process. They can kick off the login process, and then when it comes back, redirects back to the application, you'll get a token you'll get two things depending on how you configure it, but you'll get the ID token, which is information about the user to use on the front end. And then you'll get an access token that you send to the back end as a JWT.
Gotcha. I've been having a lot of people ask me about implementing Auth0, so I'll have to look into that. Let us know if you need more time to get ready or anything like that. I don't want to.
And Dennis, I don't know if you realize, like when you were on the JWT site, I'm pretty Auth0 created JWT, right?
Yep.
I see. Gotcha. Yep. Amateur here, so me, not you guys.
I'm learning something right now, so I'm just quiet.
See, this is why it was cool, James. When we started this, like I actually had a question about it. Like I'm doing a tutorial, and I've used Json Web Tokens before, but in a few of my own sites, and some of them I would just store in local storage, and I just wasn't familiar with the process, at least not confident enough to teach it. So I'm like, okay, if I'm showing thousands of people how to do this, I probably shouldn't show them some shitty way of implementing it. Like, so yeah, I just reached out, and I'm getting live help here. So this is awesome, getting expert advice.
Cool. Love it. So that's what you're working on, that demo now?
Yeah, I'm actually building out the application. So I guess our discussion, I think we've kind of answered all the questions, but James, like we were kind of discussing on how to store that in local storage, not session storage, but cookies, HTTP only cookies, and then how to process that in the back end. And just to get your take on things, we were talking about having that check for that refresh token and revalidating that token. We talked about having that implemented in the back end using middleware or something like that. And that's probably the way you would go about things.
I think the biggest place to start, first of all, is are you doing like server-side authentication or single page application authentication?
It'd be a single page. It's using React with Django.
Okay.
So on every single request, I've just seen people like actually run that check and then send that refresh token from the front end. And we've kind of come to the conclusion that that's very dangerous because now you're making that refresh token publicly available in a sense. Like somebody can in theory get that, but if you're doing the implementation on the back end, you kind of have that hidden.
Yeah, I'd have to double check on what we have as best practices for refresh tokens specifically, but we do not store access tokens, and we don't recommend storing access tokens in local storage. So there's a little bit of a downside to this, which is like there's a cookie that is, or a local storage property, I can't remember which, that says whether or not the user is logged in. And so when you load the application, if it says yes, it goes to Auth0 to actually load the ID token and in access token real time, which means there's a little bit of a login process because it has to go to Auth0, not necessarily login, validating the login process and getting those tokens when the thing boots up or when the application loads. There's deeper discussions that I don't know super technically about, like local storage not being that bad if you build your applications right. Like you never want to store anything that people can access, and really they shouldn't have. You can protect yourself against like cross-site scripting by just making sure you're intentional with the code that you write. So in some ways, some people consider that to be mitigated. But for the access tokens that we do, we don't store them in local storage. But if you did, and you were protecting yourself, validating any input that you get from users that could be cross-site scripting in a way to affect you, as long as you prevent that sort of stuff for the most part, then you could do that successfully.
Gotcha.
Storage. And see, I think I agree with James there, because Kobe brought up a good point with the refresh token, which I might have told you wrong in the text earlier on Twitter, Dennis, because if you store the refresh token maybe locally, then they have access to that, and then they can just keep creating access tokens rather. So I think personally, I would do them both in an HTTP only cookie. That way, it's secure and the access token is protected, and you can just update the access token as needed. And the refresh token, they can't, somehow steal that with cross-site scripting or anything, and create another access token, because then they can create 1,000 access tokens and use your application forever.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think if the refresh token support is done right, it should invalidate previous access tokens. Like if you use the refresh, then it should invalidate them. So like you don't want them to spam it, but you shouldn't have more than one token that's live at any given point.
So how would that work for multi device? So like say I'm logged into both my phone and my laptop. Would those be considered two? Like, so would that be locked, saved as two session instances with two refresh tokens?
Good question. I was actually going to ask the same thing. You can be logged in from your computer and a phone. Yeah. That's two tokens.
Because I think you make a great point about like invalidating the previous ones, but I'm wondering, like, so would that be like two entries in a database or something that stores different tokens?
I don't know this for a fact. I think there's two different scenarios here. Like in the Auth0 world, we don't control that, and like the user doesn't control that, the coder doesn't control that, and it doesn't store that access token inside of anything. It goes and gets it every time. So in that sense, with that scenario, there wouldn't be multiple access tokens, I don't think. I think it would just be the one, and it would go and get that thing after it has proved that it's logged in, either by actually going through the login process or by just saying, hey, I'm already logged in, and Auth0 knows that you're already logged in. In the area that you control them, if you are tying it to a cookie, I'm not sure. If you have, like, because a cookie will not apply across devices, right? The same cookie?
Right, yeah. Oh, man, that's, you got my brain working now. That's
it'll even change per browser, too. I mean, if you're using a different browser, that completely...
Right. Because the way that I've done it is that it creates multiple rows within the database. So, I mean, every time they log in, if they're logging in from the same place, then I'm invalidating the past cookie. But I never thought about the way that I just keep creating rows in the database.
You have a shitty user experience. Every user that tries to log in from their phone, they're on the computer. What the hell?
So one thing I was just thinking, does the refresh token get sent along when it's validating? Because like when it gets encoded, the WP on the server, does that because it's tied to that refresh token? So maybe when that refresh token gets invalidated, it does cancel out any that were associated to that token.
Say that again.
So like when the access token is created, it's probably not like quote associated with that refresh token, right? So if that refresh token is invalidated, I would think that would it probably depends on the implementation.
So it only cancels, you're saying, that specific token, right? Because you said the refresh token is encrypted into it, and then it cancels that specific token that was sent, which means that no other tokens would be affected. Is that what you're trying to say, Kobe?
So mine was like a half question. That was
Okay.
like, is that the case?
Yeah.
It was like, maybe this is a thing, but I don't know.
Well, it seems like, I mean, I've never had an issue with that. So it seems like it's taken care of somehow. I mean, I use a third-party package for when I apply it. It doesn't seem to cause an issue. Like if I log out on my phone, I'm not logged out on my computer in any of my applications.
Yeah,
So
and you have
I
to also
don't.
keep in mind, like a lot of the times, somebody might just close their browser, right? So you don't have the ability to explicitly invalidate that token. Where probably best practices is to invalidate a specific token if you're providing the logout sequence, but you don't always have that capability.
James,
Yeah,
what would you? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
was just agreement that like I've got some stuff to learn here too, because I don't know in depth how this works across multiple devices and stuff. What were you gonna say, Dennis?
What would you say is the trade-offs between using something like Auth0 and implementing it yourself? Like I actually watched another one of Ben Awad's videos. Am I saying it right? Is it Awad?
I say a
Awad.
wad.
Awad. Let me
Yeah.
just say, yeah, it sounds like it's
I
right.
think everybody.
Yeah,
It's funny
yeah.
how many different pronunciations there are for like all people.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just I watched another one of his videos on this topic, and I think he actually mentioned Auth0, maybe it was something else, but in theory, Auth0 stores your user information too. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
the
go
implementation then, I think if you're implementing it yourself into your application outside of using a third party, not library, but a system like this, is that you kind of get the security of what Auth0 provides. But if you're implementing it yourself, I don't know of any security flaws myself. But it seems like there might be some advantages. Like if you can implement it yourself, you obviously get your user information, and for whatever reason, now Auth0 is not storing it. But there's like, I'm curious about what the trade-offs to that might be then.
Yeah, I mean it's the common SaaS trade-offs, right? Like you could, like Cloudinary, you could build something that could do image optimization and overlays and that kind of stuff. And what's another? You could build your own e-commerce stuff from scratch and not use like SaaS products that help you with that. But it's the same trade-offs. The big thing with security though, especially when you scale and you look at like enterprise companies, like the cost of a breach of some sort is so expensive that you like can't take that risk. And if you think about like the expertise that not just Auth0, but like the people who do the same thing at AWS or somewhere else, like the expertise that they have is not the same expertise that you as an individual or like people on your team are going to have.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of 3 or 4 different things that I really look at. One is like ease of use of getting started. And so like the SDKs, like in my mind, are really good for the technologies that I work with, React and Next.js specifically. Like they just make it super easy to get started. So that's really nice. At that point, it's not really something that you couldn't build. It's just faster, probably. And then you start to look in like, what are the next features that you might want? Like something like a password reset flow. Like you can do it, but it's not super easy. Like it's definitely doable. And I've seen it in tutorials and stuff. Password reset, email validation. Once you get into, you want to add like passwordless features. You want to integrate other social providers. Like there's this tiered set of features that you might want. And so that's the second thing of like that feature set that you might want and need. And then the third thing is you kind of mentioned like I might write code. I don't know there's a security flaw. And that goes back to like the experience of like an individual or like individuals or a small team whose thing is not security every day versus a team of 100 developers at Auth0. Again, could be other companies. Like I'm not just pushing Auth0.
Yeah.
But a team of 100 people that are dedicated and they like know the specs and they know the ins and outs and they know the latest and greatest of like flaws. So I think that's the stuff. That's the stuff to consider. But that again, that's like it's not that different than any other SaaS product that you might need. Like you're using it to speed up the process and you're using the expertise from that company that you don't have the time or money to build yourself.
Gotcha. Yeah. You made some good points there. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, I guess I kind of got what I needed out of my questions, but if you guys have something to throw in, James, like if you wanted to kind of address a specific topic or go into a different conversation, anything Json Web Token focused or Jwat focused, I guess we could provide people some more value here and go into that. Yeah.
The Jwat was new for me too. I never heard that before.
Really? I've heard it a lot.
Really?
Well,
so
yeah.
there's Jot, JWT, now Jwat. I don't know. There's probably a bunch of, again, everything has its own pronunciation somewhere.
It's kind of like SQL, MySQL, SQL.
Yeah.
Or not MySQL.
PostgreSQL.
Yeah.
I really like Jwats though, because it's like it's a nice way to
Sounds sexy.
communicate with, but like the technology overall, like it's a great way to kind of communicate between like different applications, like without being able to, like I can store my own like long string of an app secret between two like server side applications I'm doing. Like one thing I did is I created a serverless function that just simply posts a tweet that I can use from any application, and I just pass along the client credentials through a Jwat that's encrypted with a key on both ends, and that way I know that that's going to be safe going along the wire, but ultimately I can have that reusable functionality.
Yeah.
Did y'all talk about like, and this may be super common knowledge for you all, I don't know about people in the chat, like has it been clear to people in the chat maybe like why exactly you're able to pass information in a JWT and then validate it? Like this didn't make sense to me for years the first time I heard it, like not until I got into authentication in detail did I really understand how it worked.
What do you mean by why you pass, right? Why you're able to pass information? What do you mean by that?
So like on the back end, you receive this JWT, right? And how do you know that that is a legit JWT? Like not only is it legit, but it also has the right information. And when you create a JWT and you give the JWT out to a user and it says like, okay, your role is read only or whatever, like, or permission or whatever, right? Like if you do that and you receive back a token and it says role is admin, how do you know that that is the original, that is actually the real thing that you sent and not something that they just made themselves? Because like, I think you mentioned it, JWT.io, you can decode any token, you can see the information that's in there. So what's stopping someone from creating a token themselves and sending it to your server?
So I believe, are you talking about like verifying and decoding and signing the token with secrets and adding on? Okay, yeah, I'm following you. Okay, yeah, that's a good point actually. So as far as that, my use of it has been on the server side. So whenever you create the token, then you sign the token and you create some kind of client secret. That's normally how you'll hear it. And whatever that is, I don't know, I go to websites and just generate a client secret and then attach that along with it. I don't know if that's the best way, but that's what I do. I just get some random string, and the client secret, I should say, is just a random string of characters. And you add that on to the well, I guess when in Node.js, there's actually a parameter where you pass in the secret, and then it does all the signing for you, and it returns that that token gets created, has an expired time. I can't remember all the parameters off the top of my head.
So it seems like you're saying the server side signs it and puts something in there that tells it that it can't be manipulated. It's kind of like a CSRF token where it knows if something has been done to that.
Yeah,
correct. Okay.
Where that comes from. So there's three parts to a JWT. If you look in JWT.io, you'll see the first two parts, the header, which tells you like what algorithm was used to sign it and maybe what type of token it is. Usually they're JWTs, but they don't. Is that right? There may be some caveat to that, but yeah, there it is. Type
so
JWT.
So see the header, the payload, and the verify signature.
And the signature,
right here.
yeah. Right. So if you've ever done a we used to do this at FedEx for verifying files. Like you take some information and you hash it, and whatever that hash is, right, is a more or less unique string representation of that data. So what you do is you take the header information, you take the payload information, you encode them, and then you take all the information and you hash it, and that's the signature. So the only way that you can verify that that signature is legit is by having the original key or public-private key pair to decode and validate that signature on the server, which means if someone else were to create a token that looked just like this, they would not be able to create that third part, which is the signature, to then be validated on my server. I would know that it was that hash did not match what was originally hashed with the thing based on my secret key.
That makes sense.
Actually, and that's what makes it safe to store locally, because it's useless to somebody without that key.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, there's a little bit of an implication of that. So it's not that that necessarily implies that it's safe to store locally. You could get into the details of like people believe local storage is fine and protecting yourself against cross-site scripting and stuff, but just because this is JWT doesn't mean it's safe to have in local storage if you're not protected against cross-site scripting. Because if someone does get the token, they don't have to manipulate that token. They could just use that token and impersonate you to do whatever you had access to. So they're not getting more access than what you already have. They're just now being able to use your access, and they may not have had that.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and that was what I was trying to tell you when we were talking, Dennis, was pretty much what he just explained, that, you know, it being in local storage just renders them the ability to do what you can do.
Yeah.
Which,
I love it. I'm getting a lesson here. I got my legal pad out here. I'm taking notes. I love the fact that I can get 3 people that have dealt with it in a certain way, especially James having your expertise on that. That's awesome. Just to at least validate what I know, because half the time it's like, am I doing this the right way? Like somebody like myself is usually working alone. Like I'm, self-taught, whatever that means today, but it's usually resources I found online. I'm trying to make sure that it's correct. And a lot of times it's either done in a different language or taught by somebody that maybe didn't have the best practices. So just needing to validate that too.
Somebody else mentioned a comment in the chat about a big advantage of JWTs is that the information is kind of embedded in the JWT that you need. So you don't have to hit the database every time somebody is trying to do some sort of CRUD operation. Like you have that access token, you can decode it without going to your database. If you stored like a session thing in a database, you'd have to go and get that information every time to make sure that it's legit.
See, and that's so interesting. So you saying it's okay to store like roles and permissions and things within the JWT?
Well, you technically don't store it in there, right? You still have to validate the user. There's a user associated with that. So you store like a user ID with that. James, you can jump in because I might be saying that wrong, but I store user IDs in my token. So I'm doing something wrong. Okay, so I store the user ID and then I validate the user, or I get the user back that's associated with that token.
So I think the combination of your 2 comments, the question is like when you get the JWT back, if you validate it, Dennis, you're saying you get the user ID and then you go to your database to get role/permissions if you need to. Yeah,
which actually, as you say, that doesn't seem like it's that efficient, because I like Json Web Tokens because I'm not having to query the database, but technically, meaning I'm not having to store it there, but technically I still have to do that if I'm not storing user information. So I guess that's a good question. Do you store like roles and permissions, like all the user information in a token?
Yeah, you can absolutely do that. Again, like the thing is, like nobody can fake it, right? Like if they send you a token, you have the ability to validate that token was created genuinely from your server or from the server, in Auth0's case, like a third-party server that you know how to verify. So you can include that information. Like what you don't want is like credit card information or social security information. Right. But if there's roles and permissions in the JWT, even if it gets out, like you don't want it to get out because then they could use it. But like inherently, there's not like private data that people are getting by understanding what your role or permission is.
So what you're saying is store important data, but not necessarily private data.
Yeah, I mean, again, in this specific use case, that prevents you from having to make that extra call to the database because you have your permissions or roles or however you do your mapping right there in the JWT.
I'm gonna have to remember that.
Yeah, that's probably like the simpler user-based metadata, right? Like I don't think the answer is to store like a huge user object on there, right? Like just like metadata that's gonna make sense to include with that authorization information.
Yeah, as you say that, I'm actually reworking my application right now because I have that call built into it to get that user information.
Yeah,
that's funny.
There's a follow-up question in here. What if the role changes? Then it's better to store your role info in the database. And yeah, there's trade-offs with everything, right? So you might have to set something up to handle that. It's one of the things that's tough with one of the downsides of JWTs as well, is you don't have the ability inherently to invalidate them, right? Like after you create a valid token, you don't have the ability to say that token is no longer valid because it's not stored in a database somewhere. So the only thing you have to go off of is the expiry date or expiry time. And so if it's still, if you don't want a JWT to be valid and it is still within its expiry date, there's no way to stop it, which kind of sucks.
That's going back to like the short-lived access token thing, though, right?
Yeah. And then gets into refresh tokens, which you can invalidate refresh tokens and prevent them from getting new tokens. And if the original lifespan of the access token is short, then by the time you need the information update, you know it's going to take place over the course of however long your JWT lasts, 6 hours or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's exactly that. That's where the refresh token solves that issue. But if it's like you said, a half an hour live token or 6 hours, I guess 6 hours, does that seem pretty long? Like half an hour seems pretty reasonable to me. What's
on
the
an access or refresh token?
The access token.
So access tokens, from my use and knowledge, generally try to keep like below 30 minutes because I mean you can do a lot of damage in 30 minutes if I'm a malicious user, like a lot.
Yeah.
So like somewhere around the really 15-minute and below range, and then after that, you know, refresh it. And to the other thing, I had a question on that myself. I guess I'm asking a question to y'all. So if it's what if you whenever the access token expired, because he was talking about if the role changes, if the access token expires, then in the refresh part of the token, could you not just hit the database and make that call to update it with the new role, I guess, or something like that? Or maybe y'all covered that and I just missed it. But would that be
to update the access token?
Yeah, to I guess update the role of the access token before you create a new one and re-sign it.
Yeah, so you can't inherently update a JWT. You basically have to like create a new one, right?
Right.
That signature, you could in theory create another one. That doesn't stop the fact that token is already out there. Now there are two different sides of this that some of my stuff is skewed from the LCR perspective, because if you're controlling this yourself and you are storing that access token in the cookie or something like that, you could, and I think someone said like a blacklist thing, but this is getting down like this longer rabbit hole. You could potentially update like something in your database that says like here are the users that are blacklisted right now.
Right.
This is not super performant, which means every incoming request on that JWT, you then have to decode it, get the user ID, go to the database to see if that database includes a blacklist that includes that user ID. So you're going down this rabbit hole. So there's trade-offs with everything. And I think the thing to consider is like, how long do your tokens live? And then based on that, how long, if something were to change that's really crucial, how long is okay for that to be the case, or for it to not be updated all the way through? So like if you have that 15-minute token expiry time, then you're saying like, all right, if something were to change on minute 1, there's a 14-minute span where we're not fully covered. And I think at the end of the day, like either that's okay or it's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's also interesting, and I think it kind of plays around this next question too, because like when we were working with Cognito on a past project of mine, I don't think we were actually able to change the refresh token expiration time. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. Like, which is interesting because it's an hour, and if you can't change that, like that's kind of what you're stuck at. Which it's still short-lived relatively, but
the refresh token was an hour, or
I'm
the
pretty sure it's
token?
the access token.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. After that thing is out there, and that's the really weird or like different way that JWTs work. Like I like this example. Like if you go to a movie and or Dennis goes to a movie, he buys a ticket for a movie. It's early, so he goes to buy ice cream. He drops his ticket on the ground. I pick up his ticket. I walk in. They don't know that I'm not Dennis, right? They know that I have that token. Same thing with like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, right? Like if you show up with that golden ticket, it doesn't matter if you found it first or if you beat somebody and stole it or whatever, right? If you have the ticket, then you get access. And so after these JWTs are provisioned and they're out there, there's nothing, with the exception of like some elaborate backend things, there's nothing that you can do to like change what's out there. That thing is still that thing. And that's where the expiry times come into play, but you can't alter it after it's already out.
That
My metaphors are on point.
I mean, that was the cleanest breakdown.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So I like this. I like this question. What's the typical timing? Like I think with a banking app, it's like if I turn off the app or close it, it's like 30 seconds or a minute, I think, before I have to relog in. So yeah, you would change it depending on the security of it. Is there usually some kind of time for that? I guess that could be something you Google up, but what's the standard practice? Because if it's like Facebook, I'm logged in months after, I think like that refresh token lasts for months. I don't have to relog into Facebook every time, even if I haven't been to it. But a banking app, yeah, that's immediate almost, like probably a minute.
And it totally depends on like the data, because there's also like compliance issues that you have to worry about, like with some people, like certain data, because like if you're working on a project that needs to be like top secret or something, like there's certain parameters that are required for that.
Yeah, that's true, because I know one of the internships I worked at, we had to do stuff just for 90 days. We had to revalidate certificates and things like that. So I guess, yeah, that's definitely app specific, and the requirements that maybe outside parties are invoking on a company or something like that.
And again, kind of to James's point, like it has the trade-offs, right? Because like the longer you make that refresh token, the higher risk you're going to be at. So it's
There's a funny comment in the chat from Brandon. Cognito refresh token must be between 60 minutes and 300 or maybe 3,650 days. So that's not very helpful if you're looking for guidance. And when you mentioned bank accounts, like I was actually kind of Googling too, because I don't know right offhand. I know it's super low, but I don't know exactly what it would be. And I don't know, like when you're inactive for a minute or two and it gives you that message and it's like, all right, are you still there? If not, we're going to log you out. Is it, if you say yes, is it getting a new access token at that point? I don't know the answer to that.
Are you talking about when it's like confirming if you're still on the site? I kind of spaced out.
Yeah. Like if you're on a banking site, you don't do anything for 2 minutes and it's like, hey, are you still here? Otherwise, we're going to log you out for 90 seconds or in 90 seconds or something.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Like, because you said you can't modify that token. So it probably sends a quick refresh token then and validates you for another 5 minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're doing like ultra short-lived access tokens that are constantly refreshing like every 5 minutes or something, and then 30 minutes later they refresh or something. And James, looks like we lost your camera.
Yeah.
Right. There we go.
I haven't figured out how to get past the 30-minute mark on this camera.
And the other camera
use the refresh token.
Yeah, use the refresh. That's the other interesting thing. Like with Regions mobile banking app, that's who I use. If I exit out of the app and come back, like you were saying, in 2 minutes, I don't even have the option to hit yes or no. It automatically kicks me out. Like I'm just booted out, and I have to, because I was trying to time it now to see, and it looks like it's probably going to be about 2 to 5 minutes, but I don't even have an option to hit yes to say I want to continue. Like I just get booted out. So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you guys for coming. If you guys have anything else, like we're about at an hour, and it's cool if we keep going on. I love the conversation. I'm learning a crap ton. But James, thank you for hopping on so quick. From your Auth0 account.
I didn't mean to comment that from Auth0 at first. I do that all the time on Twitch and YouTube, and then I log back in, and usually I'm like, hey, sorry, that was James. But something weird is going on with my YouTube where it's like not loading pages. So when I tried to refresh, it showed the video and didn't show anything else. Like no comments, no description, nothing. I don't know what's going on. It's really weird.
Yeah, my YouTube, whenever I refresh now, it keeps the same videos on there. So I'm not sure. It might just be a YouTube issue. There is a comment, though, that was like, what are the pros of using session cookies over Jwats? And correct me if I'm wrong, please, because I don't want to give out wrong information. But going back to that blacklist question, I believe sessions keep track of, have that list already whenever you're doing that. So it's already a built-in blacklist, maybe. And I would think if you're trying to do stuff along blacklisting, then, I would choose a session rather than use a Jwat at that point.
I think it's easier.
Oh, I was just going to confirm what Joseph said. I think that's possible with both, but it's probably you have more control with sessions because that session is stored in the database. So if you wanted to modify that user, you can absolutely just go in and change that.
My understanding, though, is that it's probably like the mechanism behind that with the session cookie. I would imagine that's somewhat similar to JWT itself. It just might not be using the JWT technology, where it's ultimately like an encrypted string that is used as a reference to look up that data on the server.
Yeah, a lot of when you create a session, I know I use like a third-party package for Node.js, just a UUID, just to create that and assign it to the user, and then create the user session based off that. And that's how I know who store that in an HTTP only cookie. When that goes and comes back with the request, I know who they are because it then goes into the session, checks the session storage, and it's like, okay, this person's validated. And then when they log out, their session, there's just you have a logout function, and their session gets invalidated once they log out, and you just keep going.
Yeah, I go like the idea of like single page application versus like server side rendered apps. I like spas are kind of almost the standard in a lot of ways, but sometimes I go back to like SSR stuff and I'm like, this just makes sense. Like I can do all the server side validation before I actually send them somewhere,
Right.
and it like flows better. One thing I didn't mention earlier that's an important distinction on the difference between sessions and JWTs, and then when and how to store JWTs. In the Auth0 perspective, a lot of what it's setting it up for is for front end applications to send or to work with an API that's not on the same domain. And that's really critical to think about, because that means you don't have access to cookie storage, right? Because you're going to another domain, your cookie doesn't go along that way. So for that reason, the Auth0 stuff does that ping at the beginning, and it gets that access token, and so it always has the updated one. If you are on the same domain, then you can absolutely store stuff in your cookies, and then know that it's going to come back and forth to your domain, so you don't have to worry about like going elsewhere. And then, like you said, yeah, if you have that session ID and you can associate that in your table with a user, and then you can go and update that thing and get rid of it whenever you need to. You definitely have more control there.
Did we just answer this question right here? Is that what you guys were discussing? I was looking at something else.
Yeah.
So, okay, gotcha. I just wanted to make sure we got that. So I see one, it's more of an implementation. So I see there's a correction there. So how to know whether a user is authenticated with a refresh token at the client, React state management. So this is kind of what we discussed. If I'm getting the question right, it's all about where you're storing it. So if it's in HTTP only cookies, if you are using local storage or just cookies, you're having to grab that token. And in this case, like I built it into React, I would store, and this is actually a good question because I stored that in Redux. Like I would take that token from the cookies, and then I would put that into Redux. You can, in theory, access that, or no? Am I reading that wrong?
In memory.
Yeah, because that's probably not a good way to do it then. So you might want
just to like clarify the different, like, so this is refresh token as opposed to access tokens. So like if I'm not mistaken, like refresh tokens aren't typically used to actually provide the authenticate.
Yeah, I think he means
to
access
authorize.
Tokens.
Yeah.
So
Like
what would be the solution to that? I think pretty much everyone here has worked in React at some point. I know James, you have for sure, right?
Yeah.
Or no? Okay, yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely.
You don't put that into Redux, right? Like into your state.
So what's the problem with that? Like it being like with regardless of Redux, with us, like we have a SDK that has a provider in context.
So in this case, I'm building
it.
Yeah. So in this case, I'm building it in myself, right? So I'm storing the token. Let's say I'm using local storage, which I'm going to change that method. But what I like to do is when the user loads up the application, that token goes into my Redux store just because I have easier access to it.
Yep.
Where would you, is that a safe method? Because I'm actually, like, let's say I'm using an HTTP only cookie. I probably shouldn't put that in the store because in theory, somebody can use the Redux dev tools and they can find that token. Is that correct? Like if,
there shouldn't, a deployed application shouldn't have access to Redux dev tools, right? Like,
I
there's
see. Okay, gotcha.
When you deploy, those things aren't accessible. So they're having stuff in memory should not be accessible in general when you're in production.
Yeah, that was a rookie question. I guess you're right.
It'd probably be available on the network request though, right?
Right.
Well, access tokens are going to be available on the network requests anyway, as you pass them along, except for the fact that when you do, well, that's why you have to make sure you have HTTPS as well. So as you send requests, you include that access token, and then those parts are encrypted along the wire.
Do you know how, like, if I refresh the page after I get sent back from, because like something ultimately has to get stored in the browser for Auth0 to authenticate, right? So like when you go and you come back and you refresh the page, what actually does get stored from the Auth0 side, like in the browser? Do you know? Yeah.
I need to double check this. There's like something in
I was
local
thinking
storage.
that's the JWT.
It's not actually. It can be. I think there's a configuration you can use, but they basically set this flag that says is authenticated is true. So if you go to an Auth0 app and you do what you just did, go into application and I think local storage actually. That basically just is a signifier for the front end to then go and get the access token from the back end. The back end will still know whether or not you're actually authenticated to give you the access token, but that flag is basically the front end's ability to say to hint that you are authenticated and you should go get it from the back end, but the back end will still do the validation.
Just going through some of the questions. I had somebody, I'll just answer that direct. I actually answered it in the comment section, but in this case, yeah, you're right. If you refresh your application, the token will be lost from the Redux store. So on load, what I would do is before the application loads, I would make a call to wherever I'm storing that token and load that into the store immediately. So even if you do like a hard refresh, because it is a single page application, it doesn't refresh until you manually do that. I just load that in before anything else is done. It's kind of like the first thing I do. I actually have that in my React Django course. If you want to look at that, I actually implement it that way where we load that first. So just to answer that one.
Somebody asked about how much time we spend learning about APIs and stuff, and authentication or being authenticated seems easier than authorization role claims and so on. So in fairness, like this is a big part of my job. So I get to spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. But I also you've heard me say a couple times already, like, oh, I really need to go double check some of those details because I don't know the whole thing offhand.
So James, you do this for a living and you still have to deal with that. And
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, for me, it's just one part of what I do. So yeah, like I probably, this is why I'm asking these questions. Cause I was laughing with Joseph. It's like, people are looking to me to be the expert because I'm teaching. This is just something that I'm not like, it feels weird to ask the question, especially publicly, because here I am learning and also showing you how to use it. So I have my time in studying it, but I can only do so much.
Yeah. And for me sorry. With this being my job is also pretty specific. Like I'm an advocate, right? Like my job doesn't necessarily mean explaining all the ins and outs and the super technical details. Part of my job is like not having to do that and saying like, hey, like you don't necessarily need to know everything about that because we take care of a lot of it for you. So like that also holds me back because I haven't done like sometimes the technical research that I should do to really know the finer details. So this is like, I'm taken away with like, hey, I need to do more with refresh tokens because I've never had a detailed conversation with someone because usually it's like, all right, how do I set up this SDK? And I can do that real quick.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for me, like it's been really project dependent. So like my past job where I worked on like different contracts and like we had different requirements, and like one of the projects specifically, we had to implement a system like with Cognito behind it. So like we needed to kind of produce our own API because it doesn't really, unless you're using the SDK directly, it doesn't really have a nice API like that you just hit, kind of like Auth0 has out of the box. So like we had to implement that. So we actually went through the process. Like since I was kind of leading the project, I needed to do the research and kind of come up with the design for how we were going to do this. So like the point there is that like it's really when it comes up as a need for a project, I take the time to dig into it. So that's why I really typically advocate like building projects and stuff, because that's where you're going to find like the real world scenarios that you need to work with.
See, and I have to agree with Kobe on that one because for me, I didn't even have web dev experience about a year ago. But my friend Austin, who was asking one of the questions earlier, like he just knows all the stuff and leads tons of projects. So I was just trying to play catch up. I'm like, I want to be better than the next guy, and he's so good. So he just always sits down with me and tells me all this stuff. And he's like, yeah, this is what this is for. This is what this. And then I take my own time and research it. Like I know I spent a solid week, probably 60 hours looking at refresh tokens and Jwats, trying to figure out the difference in that in sessions. Just I climbed down the rabbit hole a lot. And, you know, as long as you know when to get out, like set a duration of when to get out, then it's good. But like, yeah, it's.
Yeah, I think I implemented it in one application, like the application I talk about where I worked for a company, and I implemented it there. And then there was like a year and a half where I'd never had to deal with it. And then once I started teaching online, I just used session authentication because that was like the Django basics. And then like 2.5 years combined, like then for the first time I'm using tokens again. So I'm like having to refresh. And it's always easier the second time around, but I'm like, okay, I know the concepts, I remember all of those, but the details of just learning it and then also implementing it. So yeah, I think we can probably end it here because I want to actually post this after too. So I want to make sure that we keep it solid, full of information. James, you came in and saved the day, but made it way better for us. I have somebody asking about a video that fully implements it. I don't know where that went.
Yeah, isn't that like your natural, like, this is what I'm working on?
Yeah. So a course or a playlist, I have that in my React Django course up on Udemy. You can find that if you go through my YouTube channel. I'll just, I guess, link it up in the video description. I don't implement refresh tokens there. That's kind of the issue because I collaborated with Brad and he used it and he didn't, I don't think he implemented refresh tokens yet. So I kind of followed his methods. So you're going to learn about Json Web Tokens and how that, how sending that token works, but storing it, I'm doing local storage. That probably should be updated. I'll probably add a video for that. And I'm not using refresh tokens. So if you want to learn about that part of it, that's probably not the best, but I at least have the original implementation. So I'd recommend maybe starting there and then find somebody smarter than me because I might not be the best person.
That's the most secure, right? Because then it'll just log you out every time.
Yeah, exactly.
Not the best UX.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you guys for joining. Thank you for teaching me. And I think we all kind of shared some information back and forth and learned some. So, all right, well, we'll sign off right now then.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
See
you.
everybody.